When you've been shooting photos for a while, things just kind of stop surprising you. Feels like you've seen it all. Probably shot with dozens of cameras and settled into what you like. But every once in a while, something comes along that changes the way you think about photography. Or at least that's what just happened to me. And the camera that did it is an old legend, once forgotten, now reincarnated. This is the OM-3, and despite the fact that it might look like an old film camera, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on underneath the hood. We're going to get into all of that in just a second, but full disclosure, OM System is sponsoring this video. They sent me this camera for free to test, so this is not an unbiased review. However, if you've been watching the channel for a while, you know I don't really do a whole lot of sponsored videos. If I do take something on, it has to be something I'm genuinely interested in and think can be of value to you guys, because you are my North Star on this channel, not corporations. However, OM System reached out and they gave me a very fascinating presentation on a new reimagining of one of their legendary 35mm film cameras. So I was genuinely curious to see if it lived up to the promises that it makes. But before we can understand where this camera is trying to take us, we need to understand where it's been. In 1983, Olympus released the original OM-3, which was a professional-grade, fully mechanical SLR. The OM lineup itself kind of redefined compact SLRs in the 70s and 80s, showing that they could be small, robust, and feature-rich. The OM-3 itself appealed to the hardcore, no-frills photographer who needed something that wouldn't fail them in extreme conditions. Outdoor photographers, photojournalists, war correspondents, archaeologists, and film enthusiasts who needed a compact, robust, reliable camera body. The OM-3 became a little bit of a cult classic. It's a camera that's deeply respected by photographers, but one that never really got its due. It was discontinued in 1986, just 3 years after its release, making the originals extremely rare today, with some units going for over $1,000 secondhand. The original was compact, yet uncompromising, rugged, travel-ready, and a little bit ahead of its time. So it would make sense that the new OM-3 would be all of those things as well, right? Okay, I'm gonna read you some specs real quick, and I just memorized this first one because it's a mouthful. It has a 20 megapixel stacked live MOS quad pixel sensor. If you know what that means, gold star, because I don't, I'm not that technically savvy. 2, it has 5-axis in-body image stabilization, which works pretty great. And then it's got some pretty robust AI autofocus. But it's not the things that this shares in common with other cameras that made it interesting to me. It's the things that it does differently. For starters, it has an IP53 rating. If you don't know what IP ratings are, it stands for ingress protection, ingress being like the act of water or dust penetrating inside of an object. This has an IP53 rating. The first digit measures dust proofing and is measured on a scale of 1 to 6, and the second number is waterproofing measured on a scale of 1 to 9. So this has a 53, meaning that it is dust-proof and it is resistant to water, rain, splashes, etc. I don't think that there are any, normal interchangeable lens cameras that are actually waterproof, because the lens mount is obviously a weak point. But the fact that this has an IP rating says a lot about its intended use, because most camera manufacturers will just say, ooh, it's weather sealed. Ooh, great. That doesn't communicate really anything. It just basically says this may or may not be protected against dust and water to a certain degree. This tells you how much, and what that communicates is that it's ready to go places. This is a travel-first, outdoor-friendly camera that is meant to be robust, that does not need to be babied, that you can take out in the rain, that you can Would you do that with any other camera?
I really wanted to get stuck in the trees, so apparently.
I ended up taking the OM-3 snowboarding, which felt like a pretty good test of the weather sealing considering I'm not a very good snowboarder. I fell on it multiple times and planted it straight into the snow more times than I could count. It was wet pretty much all day long, and it felt strange subjecting a camera to this kind of abuse, but it was completely unbothered. I love the photos I got out of it on the mountain, and I have a feeling I'll be subjecting it to lots of similar abuse throughout the winter.
All right, so the camera's wet right now because it's got snow melting on it, but as long as I keep the front element clean, I think we're probably good. So good weather sealing is great. Obviously amazing for a time like this when you accidentally leave your camera in the snow and cover it with more snow. But weather sealing is not anything super revolutionary. But there is a feature here on the front that I think is pretty interesting, and it's called the Creative Dial. And it kind of looks like this. So you can see that this dial is off by default, but on either side we've got two different modes that we can put it in. So we've got monochrome profile control, color profile control, color creator, and then an art filter. And basically what this allows you to do is it allows you to access a bunch of different JPEG modifications that are built into the camera. And so the color profile control gives you access to change 12 levels of saturation and luminance. It also allows you to change the highlights, the shadows, the shading, a whole bunch of things. Very similar for the monochrome profile control. And then we've got the color creator, which is actually changing the colors of the whole image at once. And then we have the art filters, which some of these are a little weird. Some of them are kind of cool and I don't mind. And I could see already people making comparisons with this to something like the Fujifilm film simulations. And I've shot the Fujifilm simulations. I didn't like the fact that they were called film simulations. I know this is super nitpicky and very personal, but it set up in my mind that they were going to look like film. And I never really found that they looked like film. I always found that they looked like digital images that were trying to be film, which just kind of set me up for disappointment as a film photographer. You know, I stare at film photos all the time, and then you see the digital photo that's pretending to be film and it doesn't look like film. For everybody else, or for someone who just wants like a cool look baked into their JPEGs, that's super amazing. This is not that, in the sense that it's not trying to be film. It's just giving you a whole bunch of controls to have more input over the way you want your JPEGs to come out. And I think that's great. There's a lot of great controls in here so far, although I will say, I wish that there were a few more. I wish that you could change the white point. I wish that you could change the black point. I wish that you could adjust grain on all four of the images. And then I wish you could save some presets. But I think those are things that all could be addressed in a software update. And yeah, I'm all about this feature. But there's another one that I found really, really interesting. And it's not necessarily new entirely to this camera, but it's called computational photography. And supposedly this is something that's pretty standard on new OM system cameras. But it basically allows you to do a couple of things that you would normally have to do in camera, or you would normally need to bring filters to accomplish, but using the processor, it is able to pull off some of these effects. Some of them are like live ND, so it simulates the effect of putting an ND filter in front of the camera so that you could capture things like soft water. It also has a feature in here called high resolution shot, which basically takes multiple photos and kind of combines them together using the processor to create a 50 megapixel image handheld, or if you're on a tripod, it can create an 80 megapixel image, which is pretty neat. Ooh, look, there's a little bit of light like right on the top. Okay, so I'm using one of the computational photography modes right now because I want to punch in on that section of the, I don't know, the craggy rocks in the distance, but I only have this 17 millimeter lens. So hypothetically, if I turn this on and then shoot a photo of it, it just created a 50 megapixel image using this 20 megapixel sensor. Okay, same thing, high res shot, handheld, hypothetically 50 megapixels, we'll see.
The high-res shots were definitely more detailed than the standard 20 megapixel shots, but I don't think the quality is quite the same as an actual 50 megapixel camera. I couldn't say because I've never shot on anything with that many megapixels. I think 20 megapixels is plenty for 90% of people, and it's plenty for me, so that's what I'll be sticking to. There's also a couple other interesting computational photography modes like live graduated neutral density filters, which I don't use a whole lot in my work, but I'm sure there are a lot of people out there that will be stoked to have this feature.
Yeah, not even that good of a picture. Alright, so all that's great. It's obviously a cool camera, takes some cool photos, but I said earlier that there was something about it that changed my mind. And it did, but it's not something that's particular to this specific camera. It's more about the format. And what I mean by that is that this camera is a micro four thirds camera. That is a term that describes the sensor size, right? And if you haven't heard of micro four thirds, you've probably heard of full frame. Now, I, like many others, have been told since, the dawn of digital photography that full frame is better. Bigger equals better. Full frame is about twice the area, twice the size of a micro four thirds camera. And because of this constant bombardment of full frame, full frame, full frame, we gotta get full frame, I never considered micro four thirds. I always just kind of gawked at the idea that I would get one. Why wouldn't I just shell out a little bit more money and get the full frame camera if it's better in every way? And it is better at some things, but not at everything. Like everything in life, there are disadvantages and there are advantages. But I was not well versed on the advantages of micro four thirds until having this camera in my hand and experiencing them for myself. And I imagine to some of you this is old news. You're gonna be like, okay, he's gonna say the normal micro four thirds talking points. But for everybody else, I'm gonna share some of those right now because I think that they're interesting. But first we need to have a brief discussion of sensor formats and equivalence. If that doesn't make sense to you right now, just hold on because it will in just a second. So imagine that we have the same lens. I got two of these, right? Same lens, and we put them on two different cameras. Depending on the sensor size, depending on the format of those two cameras will produce different images with the same lens. Why is that? So on any lens, light enters the front and it is projected out the back, and it creates what's called an image circle, right? So if I were to shine a flashlight through here, it would create a circle of light down here on my desk. That circle, that image that comes out of the rear of the lens, is called the image circle. And the size of the sensor determines how much of that image circle gets captured. So with this 17mm lens, if we put it on a full frame camera and a micro four thirds camera, they would capture different images. And that's because if this is the image circle, the full frame sensor would capture this much and the micro four thirds sensor would capture this much. This is what's known as crop factor, and the crop factor between full frame and micro four thirds is about 2 times, meaning that even though this lens is a 17mm, it has the equivalent field of view of a 34mm lens on a full frame camera. So I don't have a 34mm lens, but I do have a 35mm lens. This is a 35mm for a Canon full frame camera. And if I hold the two of these up next to each other, you can see that they're pretty similar in size, but the 35mm is actually significantly wider and a bit deeper. But these two lenses will produce fairly equivalent fields of view. Which brings me to my first advantage, which is that a smaller sensor means a smaller pretty much everything else. And that also usually means lighter. So this camera with this lens weighs just roughly over a pound. It's about 628 grams, I believe. That is half the weight of that lens. This camera and this lens is so small and so light that it is half the weight of one of my full frame lenses. That means a lot. Lenses designed for smaller sensor cameras also usually end up being a bit cheaper too. I should say less expensive because the quality is still there. This 17mm lens with a maximum aperture of 1.8 is around 120 grams.
Now, if you were going to find an equivalent lens for a Sony full-frame camera, you would be looking at a lens that's more expensive and heavier. The one that I found is around 280 grams, so over twice as heavy. Well, when the lens is twice as heavy and everything becomes twice as heavy, that kind of adds up. But one of the most interesting things about this whole sensor size advantage disadvantage conversation that we're having right now, to me, is the way that smaller sensors and larger sensors affect depth of field. I think that there is a little bit of an unjustified obsession with shallow depth of field for a lot of photographers who don't need it. Now, there are certainly photographers who do. I'm not saying anything bad about you, don't worry. But for example, the work that I shoot is primarily landscapes, and for those we usually want to have a deep depth of field. And so I'm always stopping down, I'm always closing my aperture so that I can get everything in focus. And I think a good scenario to imagine is you're shooting handheld and the sun's going down. You're losing light rapidly and you still want to shoot landscapes, right? You still want to keep everything in focus. So on a full frame camera, you'd probably need to stop your aperture down to f8. Now, stopping down to f8 is a pretty significant reduction in light. On a Micro Four Thirds camera though, because the sensor is smaller, because it naturally has a deeper depth of field, you probably only need to stop down to like f4. That is a significant difference in light reduction. That's a couple stops extra light. That can be the difference between you having to put your camera on a tripod versus still walking around and shooting handheld. And because of that, the size, the weight, the ability to shoot in multiple different environments with fast lenses, with a naturally deeper depth of field, for all of these considerations, I think that, something like this camera in particular, is an excellent camera for a lot of people. It might even be like, the perfect beginner camera. The OM-3 proves that better isn't always bigger. Now, I'm not saying that this is better than everything, but I am saying that I wish that I had something like this when I started my photography journey. For some people, this camera will be perfect, but nothing is perfect for everyone. If you don't want to shoot digital, if you want to shoot film, if you don't have the money to splurge on a brand new camera, I understand, and I have the perfect recommendation for you. It's a beautiful metal, looks a lot like this, 70s SLR that does everything you need, nothing that you don't, and it can be had for less than $100. If you want to learn about that camera, check out this video right here.
Cut to that shot of Squidward like melting when they're like carrying the Krabby Patty pizza. He's like dragging his tentacles like